Look how many there are. Cool. Can everyone hear me? Good? Volume? Cool. Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Mariam Asad, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'm going to present our paper, Creating a Sociotechnical API, Designing for City-Scale Community Engagement. In the summer of 2016, my co-authors and I ran a series of co-design workshops as part of a larger initiative to design a community engagement playbook. This talk will go over some of the design methods and theory that we used in this project around those community engagement processes. First, I'll talk a little bit about the playbook itself and about Atlanta to give you some context about what we did. Next, I'll go over our design process with our collaborators and how that contributed to the production of the playbook. Finally, I'll talk about our design approach as a whole, which we call prefigurative design. The paper, of course, goes into much more detail about all of this, but something I want to clarify right off the bat for the purposes of this talk is what it was that we were actually designing. With our community collaborators, we created a physical playbook, which is a concept we borrow from American football, which is essentially an artifact that is shared documentation around strategies for how to play a particular sport thing. In the civic context, our playbook contains big into sports. Our playbook contains practices and processes for city employees and residents to better work with each other within the various socio-technical and political systems that make a city run. The strategies that inform the playbook were directly drawn from the processes, the design process that I'll talk about in a second, and the playbook itself is accessible online if you're curious to see the results of our work in more detail. We tried to design for a generous definition of community engagement in a city, which spans a wide variety of interactions and exchanges. So, for example, some of the plays that are in the playbook will include strategies for elected officials to better understand resident experiences, or for residents to have better access to city services. In this example here, the playbook explains the importance of storytelling and narrative, which goes to Mara's point about the importance of storytelling, to mobilize the community to act around a particular issue. One important thing about the playbook that I'd like to emphasize is that it's not specific to a particular issue or category of concern, like housing or green spaces or garbage collection. Instead, the playbook is kind of a meta-resource in that it points out mechanisms of community engagement, which is meant to increase the capacity for actors to take action, rather than us telling them didactically, this is how you take action. The previous slide showed a page from our playbook about why storytelling is important in community engagement, and this slide shows an action guide, which is kind of a how-to resource for how storytelling within a community might take place. What's important here is that the civic actors themselves maintain the agency to decide which stories they want to tell. Our design process itself actually starts independent of our research back in 2014 when the city of Atlanta broke ground on a new stadium for our football team. Go Falcons. If you're familiar with the geography of Atlanta, both the new, now almost complete Mercedes-Benz Stadium and the existing stadium, the Georgia Dome, they're both in the southwest part of the urban core, spanning across a few different neighborhoods, most notably Vine City, English Avenue, Asheview Heights, and Booker T. Washington. These are collectively referred to as the West Side. So the West Side has been historically disconnected and disenfranchised from the city, which is arguably a direct result of the construction of the first stadium. And so as a result, many residents are rightfully worried about the impact that the new stadium will have on their communities. Around this time, as the second dome was going up, a group in the West Side tried to secure a community benefits agreement, which is a kind of unofficial set of commitments to a particular neighborhood around the stadium and the impact it'll have. So it might include something like commitments to accommodate affordable housing or to hire local vendors. To sum up what's a very long and contentious process, the community benefits agreement was ultimately unsuccessful. This project is a direct result of that. It's a collaboration between the mayor's office, West Side communities, and a few other civic actors to look into how community engagement works, or in some particular cases does not work, in the city of Atlanta. Our research team conducted a series of design interventions which were aimed at better understanding the different responsibilities and roles of different institutional actors and residents in different modes of community engagement, and that resulted in the playbook. For the purposes of this talk, I'll only discuss a few key moments, and I won't discuss the last step, which is the Playbook Launch. I did want to include in this little diagram here to show that there was, in fact, another public event sort of near the end of our process where we presented the results of our co-design process, the playbook, and got some additional feedback on the artifact before it was launched. So we started our workshops with a very large and public intervention, which we called a solution session. It was attended by over 100 people, and we provided a set of civic scenarios and prompts for different breakout groups. We asked folks to discuss 2 different prompts. The first prompt, we had a bunch of scenarios written out on cards. So the first prompt was asking folks, what is the responsibility of the community and the city? This acknowledged that civic actors had meaningful, though different, roles to play in the community engagement process. The second prompt asked folks how we can help do your job better, acknowledging that these different roles necessarily collaborate with each other in order for each set of actors to complete their responsibilities despite differing priorities or motivations. Each table had an intentional mix of residents and municipal officials so that folks could see different points of view and understand different sets of obligations. It became clear that both residents and municipal employees sought out and desired meaningful interaction, but breakdowns would occur at different points. For example, where different municipal processes were unclear or where expectations or timelines weren't clearly communicated. It was important for the solution session that different actors get some insight into the challenges that other actors faced in completing the roles. From that solution session, we formed a committee of different community representatives, including municipal employees, service providers, and residents, and we met approximately 8 to 10 more times to build on the concerns and challenges that emerged from the original solution session. Each week, we structured a set of activities that built on the previous week. The paper goes into more detail about each of these sessions, but broadly what we did was we worked together to establish common goals and generate content for the playbook, which served as a kind of roadmap for how these outcomes could be achieved while serving a set of common principles important for community engagement, such as transparency, equity, things like that. One of our first workshops, seen here, was asking our collaborators what they thought good community engagement was, and we gave them the prompt to complete this sentence. Community engagement should, ... Some of the answers included know your history, address systemic racism, support Black business, use common language, tweak, and come to me. Like I alluded to earlier, community engagement spans a variety of interactions and exchanges, and so needless to say, this conversation got very complicated very quickly. You can see in the background, it just says rats. That's part of community engagement. But it was this complexity that really made the playbook as rich as it is. The variety of experiences and challenges reflect the difficulty of doing good community engagement with an urban government, where organizations are large, leadership changes, contracts expire, and the composition of city residents evolve and grow. Another way to put it is this. To figure out what good community engagement is, we had to actually do good community engagement. This is not to say that we knew what capital C, capital E community engagement was, but it was through the process of actually doing it that we were able to learn from our community collaborators and adjust. And this adjusting process and learning and iterating is at the crux of what we call prefigurative design. Prefigurative design, to take a step back a little bit, borrows from prefigurative politics, which is a concept from anarchist organizing literature. There are a few different definitions, but the simplest one is this. Prefigurative politics refers to work that express the ends of their actions through their means. And this is a definition from Chris Crass. You can look him up. It's a white book with a big global thing on the front. It not only identifies and imagines an alternative political future, but it also puts into action things in the present to actively move towards that future. Prefigurative politics have a focus on process and practices, like social relationships and organizational norms, for example, to transform and embody and actually manifest the values that the political work espouses. Prefigurative politics focus on both outcome and process, and outcome through process, and they establish mechanisms to bring a future vision into the present. This aligns well with many working definitions of design, which is why I think it's such a valuable concept to marry into HCI research. I'm not going to be naive enough to stand up here and suggest that this is a particularly novel concept. Prefigurative design clearly builds on existing design traditions in the HCI discipline, some of which are listed here. Indeed, the design work that we presented here in this talk follows the traditions of participatory design. Clearly, with all the post-its, it's a nod to that. And there's some affinity towards speculative design, of course. Returning to the anarchist roots of prefigurative politics, prefigurative design both anticipates an alternative future and changes current circumstances to better and more closely resemble this anticipated future. Through our design process, we tried to incorporate elements of prefigurative design to reconsider alternative modes of conducting community engagement. Our earlier workshops and fieldwork pointed out ways in which there were consistent breakdowns in the model, and the playbook process was meant to offer a countermodel to both imagine and then do alternative and ultimately more equitable civic interactions. Both the playbook and the playbook process are important for HCI work around civic engagement because they help us think about civic systems, and by extension, civic action, beyond privileged moments of deliberation. They point to the limitations of existing rational models and mechanisms of democracy that we currently practice. This particular design process pointed to the messiness and the contention that motivates and sustains community engagement. It points to the righteous anger at injustice that is not a barrier to engagement, but in fact a necessary component of it. In this way, prefigurative design becomes a way to explore and experiment with civic interactions, moving beyond just articulating issues and in fact operationalizing existing resources, systems, and efforts in order to work through them. Instead of transactional practices and the exchange of services, we argue for the move towards relational civics with, of course, a very strong nod to our wonderful colleagues at Newcastle, some of whom are here, who do this work in digital civics. We argue for the accumulation and strategic alignment of information and resources that benefit a wider spectrum of constituents, organizations, and initiatives. I want to conclude with a takeaway that I personally learned from this work. Communities know what's broken. They know that. They live there. It's part of their everyday lives. As important as it is to have public meetings to deliberate over issues, as the residents themselves pointed out throughout this process, the issues are complicated and interwoven. Sometimes a broken streetlight just needs to be repaired, but addressing systemic racism and economic disparity requires more than a service report and a ticket number. To quote the Post-it note, not just meetings. The challenge here is to create processes that survive all the upchurn that inherently comes with a city in order to support a citizenry that can participate in the practices and policies that directly affect their neighborhoods and livelihoods. Community engagement is to cities what user experience is to computing. It is a large, nebulous category that speaks to both general qualities of interaction and also the specific ways of doing those interactions. While everyone can agree to wanting good community engagement, the precise ways that this gets done relies on a number of local and contextual constraints, and it's our job as researchers, designers, and practitioners to incorporate those into our work. This work would not at all have been possible without the generous residents of the West Side who donated their time, effort, and experiences into what was essentially another series of public meetings. We're also very grateful to our partners at the City of Atlanta, the Atlanta Housing Authority, the West Side Future Fund for being part of this process with us and for being patient and tagging along with what was a fairly unpredictable process. And of course, I want to thank my co-authors, Chris, my advisor who's here in the audience, and Kate and Becky, who aren't here today, but were absolutely phenomenal to work with. And thanks to all of you for sitting and listening, and I think I have time for like half a question or something. Thank you.
The next speaker's getting set up. And
right.
I just want to present you with your honorable.
Oh, that's kind. Thank you. Thanks.
Austin Toombs from Open Lab at Newcastle.